All right, we're going to come to Washington, D.C. We left Johnstown, and now we're in Washington, D.C., and we're going to go to the mall, and Kevin is going to present a thesis that talks about conflict, and boy, are we in the midst of that as we speak, right?
Yeah, this is the
Exactly. Every day there's a new set of issues that come up. That's right. Do you turn the radio on or not? Okay. Anyway, Kevin, take us away.
Can everybody hear me? All right. First of all, I'd like to thank Ming as well as Professor Dupuy. I know they've been patient, very patient, as this thing has moved forward, and you'll soon understand why that is. My name is Kevin Garzon. This project, my thesis is called Subcultural Rift, an Affirmation on American Social Conflict. So pretty much, I'm going to be giving you guys a tour in terms of the content, so looking at the social issues, looking at the site, also looking at precedents, as well as the architectural affirmation in terms of this thesis. So this really started off with creating interviews as well as compiling surveys to really get an understanding of what these social issues and social injustices are that are happening in America. So they started to look at demographics, so looking at age, race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and religion. And then from that, really getting a better understanding of what was the incident. For instance, in the survey and in the interviews, what was the incident that occurred? What was the vivid description, if they were willing to actually talk about it, as well as how do they cope with that issue. So from that, really understanding this facial expression as well as their emotional state, and then also allowing them to provide a sense of reflection or something that they would leave behind in terms of advice for other individuals that have been afflicted, or if they know somebody that's been afflicted and that they want to actually share. So these types of issues range from abortion, rape, racism, immigration, discrimination, poverty, harassment, gun violence, autism, as well as health issues. And there was a multitude of them. I just chose a few of them. There was quite a few of them. And they also provided emotional, they provided the actual description of the incident, but then I also compiled certain vocabulary, listed certain vocabulary terms that they also talked about as well in these surveys and interviews. So a few I'll call out. So this idea of feeling worthless, violated, talking about trapdoors, heavy, suppressive, oppression, small, black hole, monster was a pretty dramatic one. This idea of cold, very cold, and really seeing how those issues are actually internalized in the individual. And seeing if there's a way that we can actually externalize these to create a more national understanding of what's actually going on in America, especially for those issues that are more taboo than others. And so, especially in these surveys and these interviews, they also suggested that they wish they had done something different even before the incident had occurred, as well as during the incident, and as well as after the incident. So really kind of building off of these surveys and these interviews to really inform the actual thesis later on. So as we begin to externalize these experiences, we start to think about how we can provide an awareness to those in America that actually haven't experienced those issues, or just don't understand them at all, or they actually have certain privileges where they would never experience those issues, whether or not it's based on their demographics or also where they reside. And then really getting an understanding is that although I interviewed a certain set of individuals, this is happening across the nation. It's not just those people that I interviewed. It's not just this DC area, but it's happening across the nation. And how do we really begin to compile these experiences that want to be shared into a more kind of national cohesive, this kind of social fabric of conflict? So this is really looking at cases of poverty. And I'm going to be showing you guys a few of these maps, and they're meant to be really graphical in the representation of those that have been afflicted in these cases, and not just kind of throwing numbers at you guys. So really looking at poverty in terms of these cases, as well as hate crime. And you'll notice that these are happening in more in certain areas than others as well. Looking at rape, police criminality, gun violence, And then really looking at a synthesis of just those, and that's not even that many. In reality, there's hundreds of social issues that actually have occurred in our nation in other areas as well. So looking at that synthesis and really getting an understanding of really what's happening in these areas that really start to call into what is that individual's demographics, also in terms of where do they reside. So this thesis looks to materialize American social conflict in the form of an inhabitable monument by means of externalized social experiences to promote national awareness. So based on that, I really started to focus on where this was actually going to be taking place. And although it was really a culmination of all these issues across the country, trying to get a better understanding of where is the best place for this to happen. So I ended up choosing Washington, D.C., especially in terms of the National Mall. It's a very public area, it's a very well-known area, and I felt that it was appropriate for this specific project. So really looking at the idea of this monumental pilgrimage. There's a lot of monuments, there's a lot of memorials in this site, and how can I begin to create an additional inhabitable monument that really kind of is dynamic. It's not just after the fact. It could actually be happening right now to an individual that's actually within this inhabitable monument, but how is it different from those others, and how does it kind of culminate to that central point in the National Mall? So once again, really focusing on the centrality of this idea in terms of site prominence. So really looking at the political significance of these corridors, as well as their relationship, for instance, to the White House and the Capitol. Looking at that public domain, looking at the National Mall, the ellipse, as well as the reflecting pool, and really building off of the idea that it's high traffic in terms of tourists as well as protesters and people that really live in that area. So how can I really focus in on the Washington Monument grounds itself at this point? And then once again, building on that central point, so looking at the Jefferson Pier marker, not just the center in terms of the fact that the monument is off-center, but really looking at the center point, and not even the center point physically in terms of moving to the left of the monument, but really looking at where exactly is that center point from the White House to the Capitol. In this case, it's the Jefferson Pier marker, which is actually off-center. So based on that, based on really the site selection, I started to really look into precedents that fit that site. More specifically looking at Rotting Crater by James Turrell. And really looking at this idea of the singular point, right? This idea that I really want to build off of, I really want to dig downward in terms of showing these issues that aren't necessarily in the public eye or don't really have much understanding. And seeing if there's a way to expose that, to unveil that as you really begin to descend downward into this, in this case, this precedent here. And then once again, looking at the Tempietto, and this is really building off that singular point in terms of the Jefferson Pier marker, and looking at how you're beginning to confront something that happened in history in terms of the crucifixion of St. Peter, and really seeing how they're building off of this axis in terms of sectionally, but also just staying interconnected with that singular point. And then moving forward, getting more detail-oriented in terms of the experience. So not only do I want to dig down, not only do I want to kind of provide importance to the singular point, but I also want to provide a proper experience in this inhabitable monument that I'm actually creating. So looking at the experience in terms of understanding the actual witch trials in this case, but also looking at this idea of reflection. So there's actually a separate outhouse building here where it's not that the individual is actually doing something there, but it's the space, it's the atmosphere that's actually creating this sense of thought or reflection based on the scenario that actually happened there. So with all this information being gathered in terms of the site, in terms of the precedents, as well as based on the surveys and interviews, really looking at creating a party diagram as well as 4 principles. So looking at that central point, but really gathering up all these surveys and all these interviews, and really projecting them down into this materialized idea of architecture for an individual who either doesn't understand the issues or wants to learn more about the issue, or is just curious in general, and really beginning to apply some of those terms in terms of this idea of oppression, feeling suppressed, feeling low, feeling like you're vulnerable, feeling cold, down, gray, very gray. And really seeing if there's a way I can materialize this. So those 4 principles I started to look at were this idea of descend, like I talked about in the precedents, descend, confront, understand, as well as reflect. So then I started looking at the actual site itself in terms of its connection to the Washington Monument. And really, when you think about the Washington Monument being the top of the list, there's certain ideas that come with it in terms of its significance. Really looking at this idea of achievement, victory, triumph, in some cases ego. So I took that idea and I tried to create, in contrast to that, especially in terms of its connotative meanings of American virtues and ideals, but creating this inhabitable monument that starts to dig down below, similar to the Rotting Crater by James Turrell. And when we look at this, really doing the contrast in terms of this idea of failure, deceit, defeat, or even humility in contrast to ego. So this is actually a cut going directly through it in terms of this site plan here, an east-west cut. But really, I wanted you guys to start to focus on those actual 4 principles in terms of that terminology that really started to inform why this is the way that it is. So really looking at descend, right? You're descending down, you're going down. What's the progression downward? What materials are you seeing as you begin to descend downward? As you also start to connect those to certain vocabulary terms that I'll go over a little bit later. And then also confront. So how is that individual getting up as they go all the way down? How is that individual begin to understand the gravity of the situation in terms of particular messages that somebody would leave behind? And these messages are specific to the surveys and the interviews that people actually wrote. So for instance, if they wanted to talk about their social experience of conflict or somebody they know or advice for another individual, they can leave that stuff behind. But then also beginning to understand those messages that are actually being left behind within this chandelier. It's not just about being at that singular point down below, which you'll actually see this perspective here, but it's also about being able to interact and really get a chance to understand what these social issues are based on those individuals, not just as the collective. And then as you've gone through the entire experience of coming down and coming up and up onto the actual platform, you're able to reflect on what you've seen, but you're also able to reflect on maybe an experience you've had. So it's meant to encourage you to really externalize that issue. Not to say that you have to, but in terms of really getting an understanding of what's actually happening, these individuals, in terms of the interviews and surveys, really suggested that they would be more than willing to really get this information out there in terms of creating more awareness across the nation. So this is really looking at an aerial view. Looking towards the reflecting pool in the World War II memorial, seeing how you're actually able to filter into this depression before you actually dip all the way down to the lower floors. As you begin to enter into this site, you'll notice that there are these message receptacles that are particular to actual states that have a particular, that whether or not the issue has occurred in that state, you can actually apply it to that actual receptacle. And this also ties into the actual, to the materiality, right? So as you begin at the top, the materiality begins to change and becomes grittier as you go down below. This idea of descending down and unveiling or exposing all the issues that are actually ongoing or that we may not even know about. So you see here, as we begin to descend down, once again connecting that to the actual terminology, so this idea of being cautious, fear, tense, dark, cold, very cold, gray, and how this begins to revolve around the actual main chandelier and bring you all the way down to this space here, which, using the same terminology, bring you all the way down to that bottom and making it a space where it really starts to hone in on these individuals and their experiences. So once you're down there, and that's this large image up here, once you're down there, really stepping up onto the central altar and really getting hit in the face with the gravity of this thing. It's this idea that taking that terminology and materializing it once again, right? So this idea of feeling confusion, weak, worthless, oppressive, oppression, small, frozen, anxious. And then once you're in there, this idea of curiosity, you feel stunned, there's disbelief, you're shocked, you're even speechless. And then as you begin to make your way back up, really getting, once again, that idea of the understanding of these issues. Once again, the same terminology as you begin to read these, because even as I read some of the actual surveys and interviews, and as I had the interviews, I was actually in disbelief. I didn't expect what I'd be hearing. And then once you actually get up to the top, this idea of reflection. So once again, as you've seen that, what is in hindsight? Really putting that monument in hindsight in terms of these are virtues and ideals. It is very virtuous in terms of American ideals and what we want to strive for, but it's not necessarily where we are today. So looking at another terminology in terms of being pensive, numb, reactionary, enraged, or even shouting. And so through this entire process I mentioned, these guys have been really patient with me in terms of really figuring out what the architectural, what was it being materialized as and why. Not just creating a piece of architecture that I had in my mind from last semester and really being biased towards my own thoughts, but really getting an understanding of what other people were thinking about, right? So once again, this process of descending, confronting, understanding, and reflection, it wasn't just happening for the architecture and the design, but it was happening to me as well in terms of really confronting the issues that I had to read. Descending down there in terms of interviewing these people, then understanding what they had actually gone through, as well as reflecting on what they had told me, and then projecting that onto this design. So even originally it started off with stages of conflict, but it was just void of character and substance as I went along. And I really talked about this idea of latent, perceived, felt, manifest, and reconciliation of these stages. And it wasn't quite touching on the actual issue at hand. And I mean, you'll see this on this board as well. They're kind of small over there, but there have been many iterations of this project, especially in terms of this idea of the monument, really creating an inverse monument that digs all the way deep down. That's what that model is over there, in terms of a much larger suggestion. But as I did it, once again, as I compiled these interviews and these surveys, it really became evident what I actually had to do and how I actually had to deal with the issue at hand. And so these are some additional renderings even before the ones that you see here today, but really moving towards this idea of the experiential, really looking at Peter Zumthor's work in terms of that stillness memorial, and not just about sectionally on the outside what I was trying to portray, but really getting in there and seeing what was necessary to really get that idea across. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Wow. The maps are incredible. The imagery is incredible. I think, I don't know whether this is right or wrong. There's lots of questions to ask, but I think it's a thesis, and you put yourself through something very rigorous to get where you got to, and I just find it extremely powerful. And I think that you went for it. You said, I don't care that no one will ever let me build this thing where I'm putting it, but I'm going to put it there. Because, frankly, without trying to get into politics, it's just this idea that, I can be a patriot, but at the same time understand that there's a long history of conflict, whether it's the world or the United States or whoever, that we can't ignore, and that perhaps we have ignored way too often. I think it's amazing that you tried to do this and that you put yourself through that, and I really commend you for that.
Yeah, I find this project fascinating. You're never going to get the Fine Arts Commission to approve it, but that's okay. You're still in school. There's just a lot to think about here. The one kind of architectural question I have comes down to this image, that axon, your chandelier, as you're calling it. How did you go about designing it and thinking about it? It looks like it has way more members and perhaps too heavy of members than you really need? Did you decide the density you wanted and just did it? Did
So-
you look at structural stuff?
Right, so in reality, it could have, the gaps in there could have been double the size in terms of what was structurally necessary, but as that started to go away, it really revealed the inside a little bit too much, I felt. And I didn't really get to this point, but a lot of my precedents started to come from Michael Graves' work with the monument in terms of the scaffolding. That's how this entire thing started. This all started with the monument and really looking at this idea of scaffolding and something that can change, right? And as I did the iterations for even previous designs, I was never hitting on the interactive part. So as I began to design this thing, and like I said, I didn't get to that point, but really focusing, maybe it's a linen, maybe it's not something that's so just hiding everything, you know, from the view, from the outward viewpoint, but really honing in on this idea that it's this giant mass, this gravity, because even before on my original design approaches, it became this building, and it wasn't a building. This thing, it wasn't a building, and I spent like 10 weeks on a building, and eventually I got to this point. So I mean, that's pretty much why it ended up the way that it did.
Thank you for your very thorough analysis. I think your map was actually quite telling. The sort of like graphics that you kept flashing on the screen. Funny enough, I was actually expecting more on the DC, New York area of like being densely packed, but you know, I was surprisingly, maybe it was a good thing. I was like, oh, yeah, maybe there's something missing. But two things. I think there is something to be said about the choice of place that you've decided to sort of, maybe celebrate is not the right word, or acknowledge this sort of collective sin, if you would, as a nation, because we've sort of created these monuments to our achievements and our aspirations and our, you know, sort of what the future can bring and what the past was, how glorious it might have been, and what the future awaits. We celebrated it on the mall. However, at the cost of achieving all of those, there's the untold stories that we never sort of talk about. The toll it took, collective toll, both nationally, internationally, or otherwise. But I think sort of saying, oh, there is this other aspect to modernity and the way we've sort of exploded and sort of evolved as a nation, this sort of counter to all this achievement that we are not acknowledging. It's almost like the byproduct of all of the sort of side effects of all our achievements. I think the only one thing I would, it's a red political herring that I would take off your list is abortion, because you know some people see that. I'm not a woman, yeah, right. But I have my feelings on it.
So it's interesting that you bring that up. So
it is, but I think it depends. I think it's in the eye.
It all depends on them.
I understand, but that's again, like I said, I'm not a woman.
Is this
That's
a
my
conflict
particular.
going on? Absolutely.
it's a couple. Yeah, no, it's a couple. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff in the surveys and the interviews that didn't get put up. Sure. So that is a I mean, like she said, that's
and I'm not saying, I think there might be a misunderstanding. I'm not saying it's not a conflict, but it's sort of something that's a choice that somebody makes, and it brings conflict with it. Right? The other stuff is sort of stuff that people do. They beat you, they rape you, they call you the N-word or whatever, but this is a choice. This is something that somebody should, and it's their right to do it. That's why I'm sort of like trying to remove it from the list.
There was definitely a line there in terms of conflict. Where is the line in terms of the conflict that I know of that's more obvious versus the stuff that's a little bit more taboo. I'm not quite sure if it's conflict, but at the end of the day, it's based on my own bias,
right.
Based on my opinion, right? So for me to put it up there, I still felt it was appropriate.
But I think, and again, I want to reiterate that I'm not saying that there's not a conflict. I'm just looking at it in the context of sort of the list that we made up. Second point I was going to make, again, it's a beautiful project. And I love this sort of inverse story of like the heroic ego and the achievement we've made that's gone vertical, whereas the side effect is sort of taking it into the ground. I do, however, worry about the sequence of how, one thing I love about Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, and I tell this story about my history. I didn't see it till I was actually in grad school, even though I've lived in the DC area for like 20 years. And when I finally read about it, I literally raced to it to go see this fantastic monument. One thing I love about it is it sort of allows you to sort of bring your own feeling, let you sort it out yourself without dictating how you're supposed to feel. Even though the form of it is alluding to this violent thing that happened in human history, this gash across the landscape, the black granite, black granite, so but you can read into it as opposed to, and maybe in your museum, you're not going to have it on the wall that says, okay, when I'm this stage on the spiral, I'm supposed to feel loss. When I'm on this stage on the spiral, I'm supposed to feel empathy, and blah, blah, blah. And then I get to the bottom, I get elation and I understand. Part of the sequential diagram that I have issues with is once you get to the bottom and you sorted it out the way you've dictated, then I have to relive it again on my way out. Where I've made peace on the bottom, now I'm going back up and I'm going to get in the face with the conflict.
And that was an issue. And the idea, at least I can't force people to do this, but once you get down, the idea is that you take the elevator back up rather than take the ramp.
And that's what I want to hear. Like the second means of sort of me being able to sort of take all of this into account, this heavy, very heavy subject, the toll on humanity, my role within it as a human being, as I descend to the bottom, contemplating, understanding, and then go, I get it. I get what that person feels. But, I don't want to sort of go through all of that again, because then it sort of defeats the purpose. By the time I'm upstairs, I'm angry.
And to add on to that.
I think coming back out is it's kind of the unwinding, and the fact that you can stand at the bottom and look up and see the sky.
I find that the kind of winding up and unwinding really magical about it.
So there were a lot of iterations on how you get in and how you get it. That was like the major conversation. Sure. For instance, there was a long period of time where I didn't want to come out the same way I came in your case. But in terms of that sequence of coming out even the same way, a lot of people like that. Oh, I can go back up and really think about it this time because now I know what's down there. But another sequence was you come in on the outside and you actually come up through the chandelier. And the issues that I was having in my time constraint was that this idea of the mass kind of not touching the floor was the main issue that I was having in terms of getting people up there, also allowing people in wheelchairs in terms of it's conflict, it's all this stuff in terms of people that can't access these things by stairs. And for me to only provide access to certain places by stairs, it didn't feel right. So, but the idea of coming up out of it was the one that I would have loved to have worked out.
So it could be a reversal of a sequence. That you start, and again, this is your own monument, and you're dictating, which is what's powerful about Thesis. But in my opinion, starting at the bottom, but it kind of goes against the diagram, which shows the verticality of the monument, the heroic, where it's done the opposite. Starting at the bottom and sort of emerging from this depth where you get everything, the otherness of our nation and all that stuff hits you, but you're freeing yourself as you're going out. You're feeling light, and then you escape. You get it, you leave all that stuff behind. Hopefully you've learned from it, as opposed to going back and getting your hands sullied again on your way out.
Yeah.
Mentally.
Right.
And it's almost like the question of the Guggenheim.
Yes.
The Guggenheim, whether I can't remember if Wright expected you to go up the ramp and then take the elevator down, or the other way around. Take the elevator up and then go. So, that's what I see, in response to what you're saying. I'll give it back to you, then.
I think it's actually really beautiful that you can't physically occupy that center space. Like you were talking about coming up the center there, but I like the idea of experiencing that space from the bottom. You're sort of embodying that idea of spiraling out towards the sky without having to physically have your person in the center there.
And sorry.
I think it's really fascinating that in every one of these renderings where you show a person on that center platform, it's only a single person, and I can imagine that that'd be a really powerful moment to share with someone as well. And I like that it's big enough to allow people to make that decision. It's not a tiny platform. I could imagine standing there with a good friend or two and having that sort of shared experience. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about this idea, number 4, these kind of portals at the top, and this idea of placing something in there, and you have this idea of placing it by state. And I think it's a sort of a fascinating, you use the word collect, sort of to save. And when I think about sort of shedding painful memories or reflecting on painful memories, a lot of traditions surround putting them in a hot air balloon or throwing it down the river or burning it. But this idea of collecting it, I think is kind of interesting.
So you mentioned already a few alternatives in terms of options that I've explored and options that are still on the table, but really once you experience this thing, you come up all the way up to the top. These petals begin to act as, and I've called them chapels, I've called them confessionals, I've called them so many things that have religious terminology. And I didn't want this thing to be about religion. I didn't want you to make that connection to religion, because once again, I'm already making a connection to something that only certain people acknowledge, right? So how do I get people into, you know, these confessionals and these petals, and then, but make it more private? Originally, it was actually a table at the center where you'd be able to write your note in the public eye, which to me felt not right, because once you're writing something personal, you don't want to be looking over your shoulder and doing this. I mean, people do it enough probably at work and whatnot. You're writing something really personal down. How do you begin to get out of that space and actually get uplifted? Don't get dug back down, but get enlifted, get empowered as you begin to get up on top of these confessionals. And the great thing about them is that they actually point at the White House, they point at the Capitol, they point at major landmarks. So as you begin to write these, and I wish I had rendering, but it's in your line of sight, it's directly down there. And then once you write your note, and I actually have, let's pull this off, but I started making some model iterations because I wasn't even sure if paper was the right way to go. I wasn't sure if it was wood, I wasn't sure if it was a rock. But in this case, it just became a message in terms of what the interviews and the surveys, and I started to make different iterations in terms of, is it a piece of paper that you write on? Is it something that you snap onto in terms of the pen? How do you begin to slide it down onto these rods? So as you open up that receptacle, you place it down and they all begin to slide down and collect at the bottom. And kind of building off of this idea that you had mentioned about, fire. So eventually this is going to get full. There's a lot of people in the country. So once it gets full, and I didn't run this, but I'll tell you, it's part of the story. Once it gets full, this idea of rebirth, this idea of burning all the issues and creating an ash pit down below where you really start to realize that, oh, these issues were burned before, and this is what the threshold really is. So you'll get to understand it in this rendering here, where that's actually the ash there. Because over time, like I said, it's going to gather up. What are we doing with those notes? What are we doing with the ash? Am I moving the ash? Am I leaving it there? And by leaving it there, is it creating a threshold that you actually have to step over and change as you begin to step over it, and then to get to that actual main altar?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think you've done an impeccable, sorry. Oh, sorry, go.
Thank you. I guess my question is, if you didn't have any text, what is it in the quality of this space that tells you about conflict?
Sorry.
What tells you with the architectural quality of this space that it's about conflict?
Really, I wanted to focus on the materiality in terms of this idea of not only digging down, but the darkness of it, kind of the grittiness of it. And as you especially come down, I really was honing in on this idea of a mass that's hovering above your head. And I've said it multiple times, but really trying to take that terminology and not just provide my own interpretation without understanding the issues, but getting into the issues and trying my best to materialize what these struggles are, based on the shape and based on that actual that spatial experience that you're getting once you're inside it, but also when you're looking outside of it as a bystander. That's as far as I got with that.
Why is it a dome versus a cone or?
Right. And so originally I was trying to use a cylinder, but you'll notice in, actually let me go back. So here, this is a previous iteration here where it was less intensive. It wasn't interactive at all. The idea was there's a singular point here. You place your messages in this kind of receptacle, and eventually it drops down, and these get burned. And what are you smelling? This was really tied into phenomenology at a certain point. But there was this idea of a dome that almost feels like it's falling on your head, whereas I wasn't getting that from a cylinder. I wasn't getting that from other shapes. And as soon as I changed that shape back to a cylinder to ramp back up this thing at the center point, it wasn't getting the same message across as this image here.
Well, it's funny for me looking at this and then thinking about what does it say about conflict. But to me, it's really interesting that you have an upside down dome. At the other end of this is a Capitol dome.
So,
and one more thing that when you think about I think there's something about when the American flag is inverted, that has something to do with duress or distress. And so it's like you've made this underworld or another world, and you flipped it upside down. So that's why I'm asking if the about that.
And even before that, it really started with flipping the monument upside down. That's what was the whole idea. Once again, talking about triumphs, talking about all these things, but then talking about the failures in terms of flipping this thing down, but going down just as deep as the monument is high, right? But, you know, going down 555 feet, do I need that? Do I need that to get my message across, or do I just have to get this idea of coming down or descending?
Kevin, this is a spectacular, thought-provoking thesis. And it is, you've layered it with so many different things that I keep feeling like it would be helpful to peel some things away and let go of them. And so I'm intrigued by the Pantheon existing inside of your building. That is the main feature, but I'm also intrigued by the idea that you don't want me to think it's that. But then I know Patrick Stewart's going to come here for the next episode of X-Men because what I'm trying to illustrate is, as an architect, you have a loose control over how other people are going to interpret a building or a composition or a landform. And so this is why we rely on typologies. This is why we rely on precedents. So, you know, the idea of a precedent is that it's connected to something that's not just formal. I mean, people have this trumped up, I don't like using that word anymore, argument about formality is somehow bad and that it's somehow divorced from somebody call him? It's somehow formality is divorced from meaning, and that in reality you don't have meaning without form. So you might as well embrace the idea. What I see is a whole bunch of very particular rituals that are here that are so layered and so complex that it needs an editor. And I'll just give you one big, for example, that's architectural and formal and not philosophical. We don't have to get into abortion or guns or red states. I can see where the red states are on that.
Where nothing happens.
This just gets to the legibility of the form that you've made. So there's this giant inverted space frame dome-shaped thing, and then there's a lot of competitive surface around it that makes me wonder if I were to come here and if the architect were to be a bit more stingy about views of this thing, that maybe I would descend without a single view or maybe just slivers of a view of this thing, and then when I really got to the bottom, this thing would be revealed and I would go, oh my God, this is amazing, right? And then I'd be able to occupy the space that Patrick Stewart is standing in up there at the moment and getting, you know, some kind of cosmic, you know, emotion. And then I would go. So I think I'm just trying to say it's a great job. It's thought-provoking. It does what a thesis wants to do. It is, you know, as everybody said, not going to happen. But what I think could inform this thing was looking at people like Boulay to help to inform the architectural sequences and the tectonics of the thing, the formality of the thing. Because I see there's a kind of contradiction between this inverted dome and this other stuff, and they're competitive with each other. And I think they could be worked out more. No.
I'm sorry, the second row here is staging a coup. So cool and kudos. And I just wanted to talk about the physicality for just a moment. You've used precedent beautifully in your... you've used precedent beautifully. But I'd like to bring in a couple more precedents and a couple of thoughts. So one of these thoughts is that you're descending into an underworld. And I feel as I'm looking at the section drawings that it looks too much like a building that just happened to be underground. So I would encourage you as you take this forward, because I can't imagine that your obsession could end here. I would just encourage you to think about what a cave is like. Yes, you made rough surfaces, but what's the form when you scoop out the earth? And what's the structure? Do you have to buttress it? Do you make a tunnel? You know, that what's the form of the world? So that's one thought, is this kind of cave. The other thought is water. This looks to me a good bit like the 9/11 memorial in New York City, where the water is just pouring into a void. And I think the water will be pouring in here. And I think that you've got two choices. One is to accept it, make a place for it down at the bottom. Often caves do have water in them, and make bridges so that people, can deal with it. And another is something I saw in a James Turrell installation at Rice University in Houston, where there, you do descend, but there's a roof that then is uplit from below so that it's like a hovering spacecraft. And so the other thing I'm looking at in the architecture is that horizontal surface that you talk about hovering, but I'm wondering what makes it feel hovering here. So what actually is holding it up? But before you tell me that, what is making it feel like what? Is it supposed to feel like it's heavy above us, like it's light as can be and flying up there? And how does the water move around it? Does it come in? Do you drain it off somewhere, or does it come down in a dramatic way?
So the platform you're talking about is this one here? Yeah. So in terms of that platform, really the top view that you're getting, in this one, you're really meant to see the structural frame that's holding up this chandelier. So this idea that kind of that cornice or that ring, that structural ring, is inset from the chandelier, is meant to also portray this idea that this mass isn't connected directly at the joints, but it's inset, so it even seems like it's heavier than it actually is, at least on this ceiling view. But I didn't really get to the point where how is this platform meant to be kind of seen, or is it meant to be floating or whatnot. I didn't quite get to that point. I think a lot of my focus was really, once I got down to this idea, it was like, okay, as I did a bunch of edits, which I've done so many and I know I need to do more, was really, okay, this is the project. That's the project. Stop putting other rooms, stop putting all this other stuff. But then, getting to your question about water, this thing is gonna, I go down 30 feet, and there's already water there, right, in that area. So what's that? 10 feet? Even worse. So for the longest time, I was thinking about this idea of a cenote, this idea of a water cave, and that didn't come through in this case, but in this one over here, it started to come through where it was this idea that I was actually letting water percolate downward, as if there was this idea that although there's this wall kind of holding in terms of retaining wall, there's water that's still percolating down this wall. And I'll actually pass this image around, but this is really how the conversation even started. I won't get into the details of this design iteration because those take forever, but...
What you're standing though, like with that image.
Oh, so in this image, it was this idea, once again, this idea of digging all the way down in this design iteration, but really building off of the idea that it's a continuation of the foundation of the monument. And in reality, that's not the foundation of the monument, it doesn't extend that far down, but really projecting it downward based on your viewpoint. So once again, based on your viewpoint, what am I trying to portray by that image? To really suggest that there's shrines in this figurative foundation where this is the stuff that's going on. The architecture, in this case, this thesis, is the monument. It's a continuation of that monument downward. And how do you begin to experience these as you go down level upon level and see that wall, but then actually be able to trek up that wall? And it's not actually about taking an elevator, it's actually about making a day thing of it and actually climbing up this wall. Really understanding that once you get down there, it's hard to get back up. It really, once again, relating that to the issue, relating that to really feeling down, really feeling suppressed, and really making your way out of this hole, this ditch, and putting the monument into perspective of the virtues and ideals that we want to strive for.
Let me throw out one more precedent for you, then I'm going to pass the mic. The Reichstag in Berlin, there's an inverted cone, and it has a lot to do with air. So if you've got water and air and earth.
But it also has to do with watching and being on top of what the government's doing. That the rebuilding of the Reichstag Dome is so that the public the people who are making laws know the public is looking. Right? And that's similar in the Parliament building that was built in Wales.
I just, Maddie stole my thunder because I was going to talk about water, but I did have another comment that, first of all, I agree with all that's been said about this, and I just think in terms of, you know, the imagery and the symbolism of this particular form, both as it plays off the Capitol building, but also the monument. I was thinking, I just sort of daydreaming as I'm looking at all these, that the monument is really seen against the sky. And the sky is, you know, it appears to be a dome, but it's really also, can be seen as backdrop. So, it occurs to me that something that might make this even more impactful is that, so your inverted dome is an idealized form, but the building around it might not be at all. It might be quite irregular. It might be carved out of the earth. Yeah, so this thing is the idealized form that you finally reach once you're down at the bottom. But the plans might look very different. You know, they might really be very carved out. And I think this but this sense of, you know, the underground being connected with the subconscious and with the unknown and with this sort of.
Answer the phone and tell her you're doing fine. Say, Mom,
just
I'm
put her
doing
on
a great
FaceTime
job.
for the rest
Tell
of
her.
this.
You're awesome.
Just,
Let Brian talk.
I think it's really an incredible undertaking you've done here to think about how architecture can help us access these really dark emotions. It's almost like this place of catharsis. And this is the only kind of place where we can actually do that. We have to go beneath the surface of the National Mall in order to face this stuff. Because we don't seem to be doing very well above the ground. So I don't know, I'm very intrigued by this idea and also by your audacity to both confront and face some of this stuff, which hardly any of us have to the degree that you have, and then to propose something architectural around it. I think it's to be commended, and I'm going to pass it.
Just to,
So,
in terms of monument.
I actually
Someone else has a mic.
like,
You can do
so
one-on-one
I'd like,
later. You can do one-on-one after this.
oh, okay. So, I wanted to ask you if you've seen, well, there's two articles that come to mind. One is this classic article called Counter Monuments. Have you read it?
I've typed it in Google. I don't know
The Anti-Monumental and the Dialogic, and he's like a little survey from 2012 of monuments that are both anti-monumental, right, and enter into dialogue with other monuments. The Vietnam War Memorial being both, because it transforms a site and also digs down into earth with black marble. The other article I would suggest you look at is Regal's Modern Cult of Monuments. Both of these we read in my class. And the main points I want to emphasize have sort of been said before. The first one is that the Vietnam War Memorial is amazing because it does allow for an openness of interpretation, right? And so I think Brian's comment on that point of editing down is really, really a good one. Regal's insight is that meanings change over time, right? So this monument may mean something to you, the builder. It's going to be understood by very, very different ways by people who come to it. But how is it going to be understood in 50 years or 100 years?
Yeah, and I'll just add something onto that real fast. So based on this, these issues changing over time, a lot of the research that I did before I started the project had to do with constructivism, started to do with socialism, started to do with Spomenics in Yugoslavia. There's endless stuff there. Where was I going with this? So it started to do with a lot of this stuff. I forgot what I was going to say. Next question.
You did read James Young's book on the counter monuments.
Took so long to get the mic, I forgot what I was going to say. A couple of comments. I would not put this on the wall. It has nothing to do with the Fine Arts Commission. Although I feel bad when you're holding the tuition. It has to do with two things. It has to do with there are already too many of these things on the wall. And every time another one is added, it, I think, takes down the value and importance of every other monumental mall. How many can we have? And also most, or if not all, the monuments on the mall are not about this sort of issue. This is a real life issue. I could see this, and also I think the site's way too big for this. I could see this more of an urban site, tightly packed with buildings around it. When I come out of this thing, I'm in the middle of the city. I'm back in real life. I'm not walking across the mall with all the tourists. I come in on a gray day and there are buildings surrounding me, and it's life. This is real life that I've got to get back up and face. So I would see the siting of this very, very differently. I also agree with the comment that it sort of looks like a building underground. I would have made the whole thing tighter to the chandelier and less space around it. I also think if you put it on the mall, unfortunately you won't have 8 people down there, you'll probably have 400 at a time, which would really change the feeling of this place to have it just packed with people. So I would look for a different site up in the city somewhere that activates that part of the city and talks about this thing as an issue about real life.
Just going to wrap up this. Wow, it's hard to wrap this up. First, I want to say, Kevin, congratulations on this really interesting, difficult, and I think it's a successful project. I want to tell you a little bit about Kevin, about this process, since you all have a different opinion about the comments about this building. So Kevin is really, Kevin is an exceptional designer. And during the whole process, there are at least 50 iterations he went through. And from our perspective, both Carl and my perspective, every single iteration could be a really good project. The reason he constantly pushed himself to re-evaluate and re-analysis what is his thesis should be about. I think this is essentially what we want to see in the thesis project. The second important thing I want to say about Kevin and about Kevin's project is his project touched me in so many different levels, and I think the same thing happened to a lot of you here today. The social conflict, the social issues, we all have a different experience. We all have a different interpretation about all the things that he mentioned here. But the most profound experience I have during this entire semester with Kevin during this thesis project is how we, meaning we as architect designer, could help to visualize those invisible issues, and how we can create architectural experience to speak unspeakable. So I'm pretty sure Kevin will be taking this further after the graduation, after this thesis, and also for me, I will be missing the discussion. Sometimes it's debate, the weekly debate with Kevin, constantly asking why you want to do this, what is your intention. So thank you so much.
Thank you.